Everyone. Today my presentation is on race and racism, as well as its connections to labor and activism. The stories we read this week discuss racial tensions in relation to privilege, identity and assimilation, economic struggle, and even in friendship and coming of age. Although the stories we read range from the years 2000 to 2020, a lot of the racial tensions extend back to a decade prior. The Rodney King case in 1991 became a pivotal moment in American history, exposing racial tensions and sparking nationwide conversations about police brutality. Rodney King was brutally beaten by 4 Los Angeles police officers after a high-speed chase. A bystander's video's recording of the incident, which showed King being struck more than 50 times, quickly spread and caused outrage. Despite the clear evidence, when the officers were acquitted in 1992, it ignited the LA riots, leading to days of protest. The case served as a launching point for further discussions about racial injustice, as it underscored a long-standing discord between minority communities and law enforcement. The brutal beating and the subsequent acquittal of the officers highlighted the systemic issues of racial profiling and excessive force used disproportionately against Black Americans. However, it also generated a widespread anxiety about crime, particularly in urban areas that are primarily populated by minorities. The sensationalized perception of urban crime spiraling out of control amplified the public's fear of crime and a more punitive approach toward criminal behavior. This tough-on-crime approach ended up disproportionately affecting minorities the most. California itself saw almost immediate discourse, with Proposition 184 and Proposition 187 passing within the same year of 1994. Proposition 184, commonly known as a 3 strikes law, imposed life sentences on individuals convicted of 3 serious or violent felonies. Proposition 187 sought to deny public services, including healthcare and education, to undocumented immigrants. The measure was driven by anti-immigrant sentiment, particularly in Southern California. This indirect response to the heightened racial tensions and public anxiety that followed the Rodney King case reflected the social and political climate that developed in its aftermath. The exacerbated feelings of division and insecurity prompted political responses that targeted not only crime, but perceived threats from immigration. Many saw the riots' racial dynamics as connected to a broader societal issue, and immigration became a flashpoint in these discussions. These events would go on to trickle into the 2000s, such as California's Proposition 21. This proposition was proposed and passed in the year 2000, which increased a variety of criminal penalties for crimes committed by youth and incorporated many youth offenders into the adult criminal system. Juveniles 14 years or older that were charged for murder or serious sex offenses will be tried in adult court, and prosecutors could file these charges against juvenile defenders in adult court without juvenile court permission. This shift was seen as a harsh punishment for young offenders, especially since it disproportionately affected minority youth, primarily Black and Latino communities, who were more likely charged with serious offenses due to system biases within the justice system. By focusing on punitive measures rather than rehabilitation, Proposition 21 was seen as undermining efforts to help young offenders reintegrate into society, where they would likely face lifelong consequences, including difficulties finding employment, housing, and education. These propositions would eventually pave the way for wider discussions, both socially and politically, about race. By 2010s, conversations about racial fear and crime began gaining traction. Initiatives such as Cities United, set forth by Philadelphia Mayor Michael Nutter and New Orleans Mayor Mitch Landrieu, looked towards eliminating violence-related deaths of Black males. Other conversations, such as Black Male Reimagined by the American Values Institute, encouraged the media industry to transform how Black males are portrayed in popular culture and public discourse.
All of this process and research is designed to figure out what are we vulnerable to as human beings in general, and then more specifically we get drilled down, what are we class vulnerable to? What are we racially vulnerable to in terms of images? What are we gendered vulnerable to? And so we're all sticky. We're sticky on TV, we're sticky when we go getting food. We're sticky all the time. And so I think what we really have to remember is that we're all vulnerable to this process. And that's whether we watch it or not, we need to not imagine that this is just sort of natural commerce, but instead is a process by which we are literally being emotionally, psychically, spiritually, cellularly, to go back to the food relevance, manipulated by highly sophisticated mechanisms that have no interest, frankly, in anything but making money. Now, I'm not against having money, but I am against a system whereby we can separate out the idea of money from the idea of human beings and their fundamental worth. As we've been discussing throughout the whole day and last night in such rich form, there's no question that a set of images largely revolving around criminality, hypersexuality, and violence drive stereotypes of black men. And they've driven it in police context, they've driven it in social policy context, and they drive it in the mass media. So it shouldn't surprise us. What's been different and important in terms of a distinction over the past 30 years or so is that black cultural spaces, while they had stereotypes in them, they were largely off of the mainstream beaten path. And they answered to everyday local black communities, right? With so-called integration, which is basically just making us more available as consumees, right? We're just basically new objects for consumption. And with the expansion of the mass industry, of mass media, the level of expansion of mass media is unprecedented in the past 30 years. If you just look at cable TV alone, back, you know, what it used to be, had 3 channels, you got 970. Well, they need content for all that, right? This can't just be LeBron plays basketball. It's got to be what is he doing, what's he wearing, where is he going. It's got to be all this content to have, 97 ESPN channels that need content. So what's happened is this expansion and the invasion of these, what used to be popular cultural spaces, have now really turned into mass industry spaces. So what's been very unique in the past 25 years is that now we find black culture by going to mass media. We find the vestiges, just the bits and pieces of what might be black style, language, speech, clothing, attitude, and we recognize it, but it's really a mass-mediated product. And if any athletes or any actors, or in some cases even academics, make a critique of this, the profit stream toward that individual dries up. Because it's really the marketing wing of their career where the real money is. I mean, yes, some athletes make extraordinary amounts, but and actors, but where a lot of money is in endorsements and in media presence. So anytime you say, when has anyone said racism or anything close to that apparently toxic word on TV in the face of anything? Our athletes, our actors, our public intellectuals and others have long been critical voices in the public arena to provide a space for a conversation. I think the answer is to restore that space somehow, to challenge our best representatives to speak the truth.
Other reforms, such as California Proposition 47, known as the Safe Neighborhoods and School Act, reduced certain nonviolent crimes from felonies to misdemeanors, a change that affected people of color who had been incarcerated at higher rates due to harsher sentencing laws. While the law addressed the racial disparities that had persisted, its passing remained controversial due to concerns of public safety. Some argued that individuals previously sentenced to long prison terms for drug and theft-related crimes would now face shorter sentences or no prison time at all, which could lead to a perceived lack of accountability and an uptick in repeat offenses. Proposition 47 did reduce California's prison population and decrease the number of inmates incarcerated for nonviolent drug crimes, saving the state millions of dollars and allowing for reinvestment of those funds into education, drug treatment, and mental health programs.
Stealing a gun and possessing most drugs are felonies in California, but that could change if Proposition 47 passes tomorrow.
Prop 47 very controversial because it would dramatically reduce criminal sentences. KCRA 3's Mike Lurie joins us now live for Commitment 2014 and a closer look at Prop 47.
That's right, Golston. Prop 47 means shorter jail time for future crimes and resentencing for inmates now in prison. If passed, it would fundamentally change the criminal justice system as we know it. Tony Hunter served time in prison for petty theft with a prior conviction.
I feel that I'm the face of Prop 47 because I'm going to be one of the people that it affects. I'm going to be one of the people benefiting from it.
Prop 47 would give people like Hunter a second chance in life by reclassifying some nonviolent crimes as misdemeanors instead of felonies. That means no prison time for grand theft under $950, shoplifting, and receiving less than $950 in stolen property. Prop 47 would also reduce penalties for writing bad checks under $950, check forgery, and drug possession. Opponents have raised concerns about date rape drugs.
I have 2 daughters myself and can't imagine that someone that would be in possession and or using that type of drug would be sentenced to a misdemeanor and really get no jail time.
Prop 47 would reduce prison overcrowding. Up to 10,000 inmates could be released by having their drug possession felonies and other nonviolent crimes reduced to misdemeanors.
I have 20 years of experience in various things. I had a state job, and I can't get any of that back with the felonies on my record. And Prop 47 would open those doors for me again.
Prop 47 could save hundreds of millions of dollars each year, according to the nonpartisan Legislative Analyst's Office. But many California prosecutors are pushing back, arguing that any savings from Prop 47 would be more than offset by a serious cost to public safety.
They were the first.
Prop 47, they say, would be bad news for crime-ridden neighborhoods.
Stealing a firearm would now be a misdemeanor unless it's in excess of $950 in value.
Well, I can tell you that the cost for a firearm is less than $950 right, across the board. I would say the average for a handgun is somewhere in the $500 range.
Just this year, 784 firearms were reported stolen in Sacramento County, and many in law enforcement fear that Prop 47 would increase the number of stolen weapons.
We don't need more stolen guns, and there is no consequence for that. That's bad news.
Proposition 47 will be healthy for our neighborhoods.
A coalition of religious and civic leaders are supporting Prop 47, saying it brings up the question of justice versus vengeance.
And this is a moral issue.
Prop 47 would create a Safe Neighborhoods and Schools Fund based on the reduced cost of housing fewer prisoners. The savings would be spent on school truancy and dropout prevention, along with mental health and substance abuse treatment.
I earned an AA degree while I was in prison for stationary engineering, but I come out here and I can't even get a job.
They have a felony, and as we know, that felony is a red flag for all individuals that would probably hire him.
While supporters see Prop 47 as money for education over prisons, opponents see it more as a get-out-of-jail-free card. District Attorney Jan Scully worries that fewer people will go into drug rehab programs if Prop 47 passes.
People rarely go into treatment voluntarily. They have to hit bottom, and when hitting bottom means you're facing felony consequences, and if you don't get on a drug treatment program and if you don't go straight and be clean, then we have a consequence. You're going to jail. That consequence is gone.
But for Tony Hunter, it's about funding formal education instead of the lessons she learned in prison.
I was taught how to steal cars, hotwire cars, break into houses, identity theft, write checks, credit cards. If anybody has been there where they've messed up and needed a second chance, this is it.
Well, Prop 47 is a very expensive race. Campaign finance records show the yes side has raised more than $7 million, with about half of that coming from the American Civil Liberties Union. The no side, by the way, has collected just about $500,000.
Well, it's crystal clear why this is controversial. Any chance that Prop 47 is going to pass tomorrow?
Well, the latest field polls show that it does pass, but just barely, by about 51%. But that's a drop of 6% from early July, and just 1 out of 4 California voters still very much undecided. A lot of people making up their minds tomorrow as they go to the polls.
On a few issues, we'll be talking about those tomorrow night.
You bet.
All right, Mike, thank you.
Other sentiments to establish major police accountability reforms also began to set into place. By 2012, a federal court rules that NYPD's practice of stop and frisk is unconstitutional. This policy refers to a controversial policing practice used by NYPD where officers stop, question, and sometimes search pedestrians they suspect of being involved in criminal activity. Officers were stopping hundreds and thousands of people each year, the vast majority of whom were young men of color. This policy was widely criticized for disproportionately targeting people of color, leading to accusations of racial profiling. Reforms of this policy included implementation of new training and oversight mechanisms to ensure that stops are conducted based on reasonable suspicion and not race. A look back at Rodney King's case in 1991 in conjunction with police practice reform would eventually call for mandatory body cameras on police officers. It highlights the power of video evidence in exposing police violence. This reform can be seen as part of a broader legacy of demands for transparency and policing with Ferguson and other high-profile cases driving the initiative.
Police officers in Ferguson, Missouri are now wearing body cameras. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch first reported it. Two private companies, Safety Vision and Digital Ally, donated 50 body cameras to the Ferguson Police Department last week.
They clip on the top of the officer's uniform shirt, and they record both video and audio.
As the officer would walk up on the car, this is what he would see as he comes up on the driver.
The video is downloaded at the end of the officer's shift. Most of the department's 54 officers have been trained on how to use them.
Less than a week ago, Missouri Senator Claire McCaskill said that police officers in the U.S. should be required to wear body cameras, but she characterized it as an opportunity for Ferguson police to protect themselves.
Police officers are now at a disadvantage because someone can tape the last part of an encounter and not tape the first part of the encounter. And it gives the impression that the police officer has overreacted when they haven't.
On the flip side, there were also calls for the body cameras to protect protesters.
Get back. What are you doing? Stop pointing it!
Critics point to video like this of an officer who later ended up resigning, pointing his weapon at a crowd. A petition on the White House's We the People website called for a Mike Brown law to not only deter police misconduct, but to ensure that all police are following procedure and to remove all question from normally questionable police encounters. In the past week, more and more major cities such as Houston, Denver, and New York City police departments have expressed interest in getting body cameras for their officers, with expected costs ranging from $1.5 to $8 million. Then again, Bloomberg points out a potential issue. Videos often lack critical context, and studies have repeatedly shown that jurors can be misled by variables such as a film's angle or focus, which can unduly sway perceptions of guilt. The Ferguson Police Department first used the body cameras during a protest on Saturday. Police Chief Tom Jackson told the Post-Dispatch the officers are receptive to the cameras. For Newsy, I'm Christina Hartman.
Stories Boys Go to Jupiter, Brownies, and Milk Blood Heat discuss the systemic and racial prejudices and tensions that are inherited and navigated in everyday life. Whether it's through childhood or adolescence, racial identity is shown to affect personal relationship and emotional development. As young protagonists confront the complexity of race, identity, and prejudice, these stories reveal how stereotypes can manifest itself even among children, encouraging a closer examination of innocence and how tensions can be perpetuated generationally.
You mentioned earlier in the interview your interest in characters of color, minority voices. Racism is a recurrent concern throughout the volume. Many of the narrators are women of color, black women. Often they have relationships with white people, or they're in interracial relationships, or they're interracial families. Can you say something about your understanding of why race is central in your work, and what are the sort of things you want people to think about or take from your meditations on race?
Well, I mean, there are moments where it's a writing concern, and there are moments where it's a thematic concern, and those operate somewhat differently for me. But, you know, in the way that we come back to nothing comes from nowhere, that idea that we're always describing the world from a particular vantage point, you know, if you're moving through the world in a particular body, it's going to shape everything, like the geography of cities. If you ask people to write a paragraph about, you will get answers based on where people feel safe, where people feel unsafe, where people feel noticed as different, where people can like get a cab, where people are made to feel welcome, right? That there's, if we ask people where the safest place in the city is, like you'd get different answers depending on who that person is in their lived experience of the world. And so partly it's just a matter of realizing that like even if the story is not about race and that it's the explicit kind of conflict or plot of the story, it's affecting all the other details that come in. It's affecting what people notice and what they choose to tell you. And so being aware of that in terms of thinking about my narrators and how they talk about the world, even the sort of physical space of it, is important. And then there are moments where it is a more thematic issue, and I think then it becomes one of those questions of like, how do we translate or talk across these kinds of things? Like, in some ways, I think of the generation of that a lot of these narrators come from as having experienced almost like a migration experience without moving, that the world that they grew up in is in some ways very different than the world that pre-civil rights movement Black parents grew up in terms of what was possible. It also has many of the same kind of perils and things that haven't changed. And so the ways in which you can and cannot be prepared for the country that you live in, even when it's the only country that you have, when the tensions come more explicitly to the surface, that's part of what I'm interested in, and sort of what can't we prepare the people we love for, or what can't we understand the people we love telling us, because the world that they live in is in some ways fundamentally different than ours, whether it's because we're inhabiting the same present in different ways, or because we have this sort of other history that is useful in ways to pass on, and also like doesn't prepare people for a world in which there's at least the pretense of equality. And so, and also the ways in which there's, of course, obvious structural inequality, which when you're rating stories are always about choices. Some people just have fewer choices than others. And so remembering that you don't want to take away agency from characters, that you don't want to write characters who are sort of so flattened by their circumstances that they can't exist as characters. But then also that's just sort of describing the structural reality of the world, which feels like a political task because we're asked so often to ignore it. But it's actually just description, that there are ways in which some people don't have as many good options as other people.
Conversations about racial tensions also gain traction in other forms. The years 2010 to 2020 saw heightened awareness around racial inequality, labor exploitation, and immigrant rights, as well as renewed discussions about the intersection of race, class, and work. These stories explore the tension between identity and labor, particularly through a lens of racial and cultural otherness. They speak of the way labor roles, particularly the ones filled by people of color, are often shaped by the racialized expectations of society. The post-2008 financial crisis period, a time during which economic inequality issues took center stage, particularly affected people of color. The rise of movements like Occupy Wall Street, discussions around wealth inequality, and critiques of neoliberal capitalism all reflect the broader socioeconomic tensions of the time. Many communities of color who face higher rates of unemployment and underemployment during this era. The socioeconomic divisions grew, so did class disparity and racial attitudes towards immigrant communities. This rhetoric brought attention to the way race intersected with economic status and the judgment that eventually arises from that economic difference. The 2000s also saw increased organizing among low-wage workers, many of whom were people of color. Movements like the Fight for 15, which began in 2012, sought to address racial and economic inequality by advocating for higher minimum wage and better working conditions for workers in industries like fast food, retail, and healthcare, where Black and Latino workers were overrepresented. The movement connected economic inequality with racial injustice, highlighting the exploitation of Black and Latino immigrant laborers.
Brothers and sisters, thank you all for coming out and standing up for justice, standing up for dignity, and for saying loudly and clearly that people in this country who work 40 hours a week deserve a living wage, and workers in our city here and all over this country deserve the right to organize a union. In America today, what we are seeing is the richest people becoming richer and almost everybody else becoming poorer. And what we are saying is enough is enough. Workers who work for the United States government deserve the right to raise their children in security. They deserve the right to earn enough to live in a decent apartment or a decent house. They deserve the right to bargain collectively. Now, there are a number of senators who get served by people right here. And they should know that if you are serving them, they have got to start serving you by telling Compass Group that Compass will pay you a living wage. And what I also want to say, what you are doing and workers all over the United States are doing, you are having a profound impact. You're seeing in Los Angeles, in San Francisco, people raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. And you know who did that? You know who started it? You did. You started that movement. So you should be very proud of what you have accomplished. Now we've got to finish the job. $15 and a union. Thank you.
Other immigration reform efforts, such as the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, otherwise known as DACA, addresses the intersection of race and labor within immigrant communities. Immigrant labor is often undervalued and marginalized, tapping into how immigrants are essential to the labor market, yet remain politically and socially disenfranchised. DACA was able to provide protection for around 800,000 young immigrants, many of whom were already integrated into the U.S. labor force. The program also highlighted issues related to immigration and labor rights, as many DACA recipients filled essential roles in industries like healthcare, agriculture, and education. Conversation about race, once largely centered on identity and representation, has expanded to include labor rights, immigration, and socioeconomic disparities, particularly from 2000 to 2020. These stories remind us that the political climate surrounding race is not only a matter of social justice, but also one of economic justice, where racial minorities often bear the brunt of inequitable labor conditions. Together, these stories exemplify how the characters' struggles with labor are deeply intertwined with their racial and economic identities, reflecting broader societal debates on labor rights. They highlight the enduring need for policies that address the intersection of race, labor, and economic inequality, as these issues continue to disproportionately affect people of color in low-wage and precarious work.